think it means the industry being innovative and creative and trying to find solutions to not just providing new supply of housing, but also trying to do it in ways that meet wider agendas, such as energy efficient housing that is near workplaces, or that can accommodate places in which areas in which people can work, and housing that meets the kind of design and quality standards that people now tend to be aspiring to. So yeah, I think if it's building for tomorrow, it means building in a way that is future proof and is able to meet today and tomorrow's aspirations. Yeah, I mean, the housing market has been changing over the last 20 to 25 years. It probably has been changing longer than that. It's a cyclical market, but over the last 20 years, we've seen some marked change from the kind of the bubble that we had in the noughties, then the crash that we had at the end of the noughties, and then the kind of a plateauing, rather flat market for a few years after that, and then a market that kind of picked up from about mid 2013 after the economy came out of recession, and Help to Buy and other stimulus packages helped to get everything moving again. But even though the market then rose for a few years, it's kind of stalled again in recent years in terms of activity. And then, of course, COVID has hit it quite hard, although it has bounced back after the first lockdown, but it's still not really made up all of the ground that was lost last spring. So it's a market that's been going through quite a lot of change, not just in the sales market, the second-hand sales, but also new build market, lettings market. We're seeing, for example, the advent of build to rent becoming a major new asset class in the letting sector. And we're seeing other types of innovations around carbon neutral standards and 20-minute neighbourhoods also come into fashion in the last couple of years. So I suppose my talk would be around examining these trends, why we've ended up where we are, and what the future outlook is going forward. I think there's been a few. I think in the new build sector, it's developers now coming in at the kind of the family and at the prime end. That wasn't really the case before, but we've seen over the last decade in particular, developers now building more ambitious and more valuable product. So that's been a significant change. I think also the concentration of the sector we've lost. I don't think it's a good thing. We've lost a lot of the small and medium-sized house builders during the recession, and we haven't got them back. It's more difficult for them to raise development finance, and the industry now tends to be dominated by a relatively small number of big players. So we've maybe lost a little bit of diversity and creativity as a result. But on the plus side, I suppose you've got a kind of a concentration of expertise now in some of these big companies, and that's enabled them to go tap into the types of new markets that I've just discussed. In the lettings market, I think we've seen peak private rented sector. I think in Scotland we've got up to about 17-18% of the population living in the private rented sector. I don't think that's really going to push on much further. But what we will see, and what we are beginning now to see, is a greater professionalisation of that sector. So it's going to be become less reliant on the kind of the small buy-to-let landlords, who will still have a place, but at the moment they have 95 to 99% of the stock. But we're beginning to see now the institutional investors get into this space. There's a growing pipeline. We've already now seen cities like London and Manchester have BTR developments that have been successful, which are encouraging more investment into the sector. And Scotland, Glasgow and Edinburgh is now a nascent market. We are going to shortly get a volume of units operating in Scotland's two main cities. And again, that's going to create a kind of a stampede effect, I think, just like a lot of institutional investors got into student accommodation in days gone by and turned that sector around very quickly. I think we will see build to rent and similar types of rental accommodation like co-living now become more popular as the sector develops and becomes more professionalised. I think COVID has accelerated a number of trends that were already there. So, we had been seeing, for example, a kind of a drift from the cities into accessible rural areas, the towns that are still, commutable to the big cities. So, there's been demand pressures or greater demand pressures in those markets, for example, in the hinterland areas outside the likes of Edinburgh and Glasgow. If I'm looking at the kind of the Scottish market that I specialise in, house prices have been rising fastest in the likes of East Lothian and Mid Lothian, just outside Edinburgh, than they have been doing in Edinburgh itself. And in the likes of North Lanarkshire, again, a commuter family housing market to Glasgow. So house prices have been rising there a good bit faster than they have been in the Glasgow urban market. So, one of the things that put people off, I think, moving to these areas where they can have maybe a better lifestyle. There's perhaps better schools as well in some cases, and they can have rural-like living with access to good quality outdoor space. And I think what put a lot of people off kind of taking the plunge and maybe moving out a bit further outside the cities was the commuting, particularly if you're going to come in by car. But coming in on a packed train isn't particularly easy either. So with the advent of COVID and the pandemic, what we've seen is a greater move towards home working. We've proven that it's possible to work remotely. Entire businesses have been able to work effectively remotely, including ours, since the pandemic started. So although I think there will still be demand for people to get together in office environments, it's important, I think, for the creative process. I don't think people will be going back to the same type of 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 commuting that was kind of de rigueur before the pandemic. It's more likely that they will be going into the office maybe a couple of days a week and then working remotely from home, which means that trade-off that you have between moving to rural areas where you perhaps get more bang for your buck and accessible outdoor space, that trade-off between that and commuting perhaps is now weighted more towards the better lifestyle choices. So that's likely to accelerate, I think, again going forward. And I think in the rental sector, the sector's coped quite well with the pandemic, but there has been a lot of short-term let properties that have come back onto the market, and there has been demand for those properties in order to soak up the supply, particularly in places like Edinburgh that had a very big Airbnb sector. But going forward, I think it's likely that we will see the greater professionalisation of the buy-to-let sector. That's going to become more corporate, and then with the build-to-rent sector coming in as well, I think it's been able to demonstrate in the pandemic that it's been able to function normally in terms of rent collection levels, and is still seeing good demand for its product. So what it's been able to demonstrate to the institutional investors who may be thinking about moving into this sector is that it has been resilient. Yeah, I do. I think there are these kind of lifestyle drivers now that will accelerate sales, but I think it's important to bear in mind that, at least in Scotland, although the market has picked up significantly since the summer, it's still likely over the whole course of 2020 to be at least 20% down. So there's far fewer transactions happening by the end of 2020 than we would normally expect in a calendar year. Now, we may get some pickup in 2021, but again, the economic risks, particularly tax rises to pay for the pandemic, and a lot of business attrition likely, or job attrition likely after the furlough period ends, means that we will get I think it's highly likely we will get another significant economic shock. And the housing market is pro-cyclical; it tends to move with the wider economy. So that will mean that there's greater risk to the housing market in terms of reduced transactions and activity, I think, at least this year, and maybe even spilling into 2022, rather than the opportunity for the sector to grow. So although I think you will get that lifestyle demand that will push up house prices in certain areas, the concern is that people in a pandemic and a resulting economic downturn will sit tight, which will reduce the flow of property on the market, even though you've got that heightened demand, which the likely consequence or implication of that is going to be increased house prices for properties that are sold. I think we've all been kind of starved, really, of good conferences and seminars over the last year or so. So it's good to get a variety of perspectives on different markets and how they've been performing, and the conference certainly promises to deliver that. Plus, there will be networking opportunities to kind of catch up with old friends, maybe meet some new friends, and as ever with these types of events, it's not just the kind of the presentations that's the most appealing part. It's getting to meet other property professionals and sharing some of their perspectives and insights.